your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello and thanks for joining us. Lethbridge police have charged a 51-year-old man with manslaughter in connection with the death of a 78-year-old resident at a local care facility. On January 6th, police were notified of the death of Kenneth Hale, who was a resident of St. Michael's Health Center on the city's south side. Hale's body was taken to Calgary for an autopsy. Following an investigation, police determined that Hale was assaulted by another resident at the facility on December 26th of last year. Hale died from his injuries around a week later. 51-year-old Wesley Red, young man of Lethbridge, is charged with manslaughter and aggravated assault. He will have to undergo a fitness and NCR assessment to see if he's fit to stand trial. During a court hearing February 23rd, Kara Lebison, who is a defense lawyer for Red Young Man, told the court her client suffers from Alzheimer's and dementia and that his wife was appointed as his power of attorney. The case has been adjourned until March 24th until the NCR assessment has been completed. Coming out of a cold snap, the folks at Streets Alive say they've been fairly busy trying to help most of our vulnerable stay safe and warm. Temperatures dropped to the low -30s with a wind chill this past week. Director of Operations Cam Kissick says when the mercury plummets by this much, warm clothing and shelter are vital to saving lives.
Are providing as much cold weather clothing and gloves and toques and layerable wear and good shoes as we possibly can. We have our outreach team that's out all day, all night when it's not below -10. However, when it drops below -10, our outreach then staff is 2 buses that are parked outside of the shelter provided by the city of Lethbridge to help with the overflow from the shelter. So on top of that, of course, we continually are monitoring for frostbite and all those types of things.
Kissick also says they appreciate the support of the city and how City Council is looking into the potential of around $215,000 worth of funding annually for the group up until the year 2026. Now, one of the biggest fundraisers for Streets Alive was this weekend, the annual coldest night of the year, which took place Saturday night. Many of our most vulnerable also headed to the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen for help during the frigid cold temperatures. The Soup's Kitchen Executive Director Bill Ginther says that they're not only able to offer a place to warm up, but also some hot food for those who need it most.
We're really very thankful that we are able to do this. We've done it since 1984, and we started off with 1 light lunch 6 days a week. We now do 3 meals a day, every day of the week, and up to 10,000 meals a month. And we know, like everyone else does, that when it's really cold outside, the best thing you can do is have a warm place to go and a hot meal. And we make sure of that. And we have excellent people that prepare these meals. And it's really difficult to watch people outside like this in this weather.
Ginther adds that they're in need of gloves to help provide for some of the city's homeless. The Soup Kitchen works with many churches and service clubs in Lethbridge and has had upwards of 800 volunteers. New West Theatre has provided a wide variety of theatrical and musical shows over the past 30 years in Lethbridge. Last year, the organization said they were in trouble financially and had to fundraise $150,000 to be able to stay afloat. Kelly Ray, the artistic director for New West, says that they've completed phase 1 of the Save Our Stage fundraiser campaign and are now heading into phase 2.
Yeah, we're really thrilled with how the campaign is going. Phase 1 completed at the end of December, and we met our goal of $35,000 for that first phase. And phase 2 launched on January 1st, and we're right in the middle of that phase. And the goal for that phase is $65,000, and we're really pleased to report that we are just over $27,000 raised in phase 2 of the campaign for a grand total of $62,000 so far. And, with our outside goal being $150,000 by the end of the calendar year.
New West Theatre has an upcoming show called Nightlife, with proceeds going to phase 2 of the Save Our Stage fundraiser. Next, the Auditor General releases a report on COVID, and Alberta gets a bad grade. Plus, cancer patients in the province could see longer wait times to start treatment. That plus more after the break.
Are they not giving him the treatment because they don't think he is going to survive? Or is it because of the backlog? Sadly, we know he is not the only one enduring this agonizing limbo.
Well, some good news for our province. The film industry in Alberta seems to be booming. Many of us have had the opportunity to check out the new hit series, The Last of Us, on HBO. According to industry experts, the show will generate over $200 million in revenue for Alberta. The show was shot entirely in the province and has showcased the Alberta legislature, the Lethbridge high-level bridge, and the historic Fort Macleod downtown area. A University of Lethbridge alumna, Lindsay Kapitsky, was able to work hands-on during the making of the show as a costume buyer for the actors. She explained the interesting things she did to make each character shine.
I would meet with the design team and we would kind of discuss the script and the characters that were involved and things like that, and how we wanted to bring them to life through their wardrobe. The design team had a lot of access to the concept art from the game, so we were able to pull from that heavily, which was very valuable to us. And then once we kind of had discussed the characters and things like that, the design team would kind of give us a list of things that they were looking for. And then me and the rest of the buying team would go out into Calgary to source whatever we could locally. Obviously, there would be some things that we would need to buy internationally and source online.
Kapitsky says Alberta's film industry is flourishing, and she's hoping to have additional chances to highlight her talent in the future. Alberta's Auditor General says severe staff shortages led to major care home problems during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doug Wiley's report examined how health officials and those in Alberta's 355 continuing care homes coped over the first 8 months of COVID in 2020. During that time, there were 379 COVID outbreaks, more than 8,300 cases and 1,042 deaths in care homes. He says staff shortages were by far the most common problem. And according to Alberta's NDP opposition, if you're diagnosed with cancer, you could be looking at an 8 to 10 week wait to see an oncologist in Alberta due to a staff shortage and backlog of patients. One Alberta woman named Sheila says her husband was diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 lung cancer in the beginning of January and still has not received treatment.
Are they not giving him the treatment because they don't think he is going to survive? Or is it because of the backlog? Sadly, we know he is not the only one enduring this agonizing limbo of waiting for potentially life-saving treatment. Waiting is torture.
Albertans on a waiting list to receive potentially life-saving treatment deserve to know why they're on that waiting list. It's because is it because there's a staffing shortage, limbo, or what? It's unacceptable that people are diagnosed with potentially life-threatening illness and are waiting at home for months. If the answer is that there's no real treatment options, then the patient deserves to be told that. If the answer is a staffing shortage, that the UCP government must address that critical issue today.
Meanwhile, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says her government has more plans for investing in recovery-oriented care. She says she shared the details at the 6th Annual Recovery Capital Conference in Calgary. Smith says more work needs to be done to help Albertans who are struggling with addictions issues.
We set out with an initial commitment to spend $140 million over 4 years to address the addiction crisis taking place here in Alberta. And with that funding, our initial goal was to support an additional 4,000 Albertans every year to access detox treatment and recovery by funding more beds across the province. Now, 4 years later, we're partnering with organizations across Alberta, and we're supporting over 10,000 more Albertans every year with barrier-free access to these services. Next, we eliminated all user fees for publicly funded addiction treatment. It was a massive step forward because under previous governments, Albertans had to pay $40 a day to access publicly funded treatment beds.
Last week, the federal government released its Sustainable Jobs Plan, which is the new name for the just transition. It somewhat slipped under the radar for some, but do people in Alberta have a reason to be concerned about this plan? Well, our federal political correspondent Brian Lilly says yes, they do.
Because it's aimed four square at the oil and gas industry in Western Canada. And it doesn't have a lot of details. It's 32 pages, talks about moving towards a clean energy economy, away from dirty oil and dirty gas. It gives no credence to the fact that liquefied natural gas and natural gas general are cleaner burning fuels. The whole world sees them as a transition fuel, but the Trudeau government doesn't. Danielle Smith said she's incredibly worried about what it means for workers in Alberta in the future. This is something to be concerned about. The government's been talking about this for a long time. They released their plan, very few details, just that they're moving ahead. Well, when that happens, be worried, be very worried.
We'll be right back with more after the break. Well, it's been exactly 1 year this weekend since Russia invaded Ukraine, and while it seems like that situation continues to grow, we have the alleged issues of China interfering in Canadian elections, and then the claim that China and America are flexing their muscles and sending balloons over to spy. Our producer, Michael Clausen, sat down with Dr. Christian Leuprecht to talk about the issues with Canada and China and our need to work with the U.S. for continental defense. Have a look.
Now, in your recent article in the Globe and Mail, you point out that these air intrusions do reveal that we are unfortunately vulnerable to our enemies. How vulnerable are we?
Well, the success of this continent really since 1940, in what is known as the Kingston Dispensation, has really been built on the security of the continent, where Canada and the US got together and basically forged a pact, a functional arrangement where they agree that anything that poses a threat to one country also poses a threat to the other country. And so that they built a joint system to defend the continent, the airspace of the continent, but also subsequently the maritime approaches. And that strategy has arguably made North America the most prosperous, politically stable, and desirable continent that history has ever known. And so when you're able to demonstrate that actually those defenses can be breached, and you're very deliberately sending a signal about the vulnerability of being able to breach those defenses, that is a clear signal on one hand by an adversary who is intent on bringing geostrategical competition to our own continent and our own skies. And it is also a realization on our part that what we have been doing and investing in keeping the continent safe, secure, and protecting our sovereignty has been insufficient relative to both the intent by our adversaries as well as the capacities and capabilities that our adversaries have built and are building in order to press us hard in this new era of geostrategic rivalry.
Right, that makes a lot of sense because the citizenry can be distracted by work and living and day-to-day tasks, and then the governments can maybe have other things on their plate. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how U.S. and Canadian governments are reacting to these new airborne threats? And perhaps maybe a better question is, how should they be reacting?
So, as you can see, the reactions come entirely from the United States, including the first balloon that crossed Canadian airspace, ostensibly Yukon and all of British Columbia, without any announcement or so from the government of Canada. To the contrary, the only announcement we got was that we called in the Chinese ambassador to express our apparent displeasure. And I have a feeling, given that the way that China has treated Canada, the Chinese ambassador would have been unlikely to take any lectures from Canadian officials. At the same time, you get the U.S. Secretary of State coming out explicitly saying that this is a brazen violation of our sovereignty. It is a brazen violation of international law. So you can contrast those two reactions, and you might ask yourself, so why is it that the Canadian government has not been more forceful? I mean, you can also put this in the context of recent revelations of everything from influence campaigns in China, of academics, private sector people, politicians, to Chinese attempts to manipulate our election system, secret police stations that China runs in this country, all of it apparently with impunity, and all of it without much pushback from the federal government. So you can see two very distinct approaches when it comes to China, and I think that does not bode well for the overall defense of the continent, because ultimately Canada and the United States need to be on the same page when it comes to continental defense and continental sovereignty.
You mentioned the Chinese military police stations or outposts, and you've also mentioned the election interference. What do you take away from that as far as how maybe China views Canada?
Well, we know exactly how China views Canada, because if we look at last November's meeting in Bali, where Xi Jinping effectively humiliated the Canadian Prime Minister, it clearly showed that China has complete disregard and complete disrespect for this country. And so this is why it's puzzling to me that our federal government continues somehow to try to thread the needle with an adversary that has clearly shown that they have no intent of respecting us or our interests.
When we return from this next break, we hear from Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas about the events that led up to the Freedom Rally in Ottawa and Justice Rouleau's report. Stay with us. What is the level of expectation Canadians should have when it comes to trusting federal politicians and their standards for ethics and truth? Can our democracy function for the utmost benefit of Canadians? Well, some feel parties may abandon their principles for a chance at holding the reins of power. Hal Roberts and Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas talked about this earlier in the week. Have a look.
So what were your final thoughts on Justice Rouleau's report? He said the government had some missteps along the way, but overall the Trudeau government was justified in invoking the act last February.
Mm-hmm. I think in order to fully understand, what happened here, we have to recall or be reminded of the events that led up to Canadians, gathering on Parliament Hill and wanting their voices heard. There was a certain desperation in that appeal, a certain desperation in thousands of Canadians showing up in Canada's Parliament or Canada's capital and wanting their voices to be acknowledged, right? And of course, those events were that fall, just a few months before, the Prime Minister had called an election in the middle of a pandemic. So on the one side, he was telling Canadians to stay home and stay safe. And on the other side, he was saying, come out and listen to me speak and don't forget to vote. And ultimately, there was no need for this election. There was no requirement for this election. Instead, it would appear that it was completely politically motivated, something that the Prime Minister called in order to try to secure another majority government. Ultimately, we know that backfired on him. But at the end of the day, I think Canadians were left, feeling less trustful of government. But also the other thing that happened during that election was the Prime Minister took the opportunity to create wedge issues and to go after certain Canadians for holding what he called unacceptable views. The Prime Minister even went so far as to start calling individuals names. One of his own members of Parliament revealed the strategy and said, really, the Prime Minister's strategy, he said, and I'll quote, he said, a decision was made to wedge, to divide, and to stigmatize. That is from a Liberal member of Parliament understanding the inside strategy. So you have a Prime Minister who is functioning with this type of behavior, and Canadians were feeling desperate and wanting to be heard. So they showed up on Parliament Hill.
Let's circle back to the election for just a moment here. I'm glad you brought that up. A recent report by the Globe and Mail says CSIS has evidence that China interfered in the 2021 federal election, which helped Justin Trudeau and the Liberals get reelected. Your party is calling on the Trudeau government to show some more transparency here. In your opinion, what would that really look like?
Well, I think these reports from CSIS are deeply disturbing. And if our Prime Minister is truly interested in being, a statesman, a leader governing rather than playing politics, then he should stop deflecting and actually do a thorough investigation. Because these allegations are very alarming, and Canadians deserve to know that the democratic system is being upheld in this country. And so when the Prime Minister goes out there and instead he starts scapegoating or deflecting, it actually creates distrust, not only toward him, but towards our very institutions that have upheld this country for over 150 years. So, I think the Prime Minister has a responsibility to function with integrity in this instance, to take these concerns with seriousness, and to make sure that we get to the bottom of it. Canadians deserve that.
Now, Rachel, you have your pulse on what's going on Parliament Hill. Is there any talk of NDP leader Jagmeet Singh potentially pulling the plug on the coalition, or will he keep the Trudeau government propped up until, the year 2025, which was part of the original plan?
I laugh because I wish I understood the mind of Jagmeet Singh. It's incredible, isn't it? On the one side, he's claiming to be opposition and to be holding this government to account, and he'll say things of that nature. And then on the other side, he's in bed with the Liberal government. He's propping them up. He's supporting them at every move. And so I just don't understand how you can be both. It's incredibly disingenuous. And it's actually a betrayal of New Democrat principles. And so I don't know that I would have much more to say other than that. My hope is that Jagmeet Singh and his team figure themselves out. It seems that they're undergoing, or going through a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. I think Canadians, that they deserve a true functioning democratic system where there is true opposition in place, where the government really is being held accountable. And so my hope is that the NDP are able to reestablish their footing.
After the break, commentary from the provincial capital, budgets and elections, the money, the power, and the people. That's next. The UCP are leading the NDP in the polls as we get closer to the May 29th election. The Alberta budget is expected to be delivered by Finance Minister Travis Toews on the 28th. Insiders say this will be a responsible budget. Up next, Hal Roberts and Tyler Dawson discuss the budget and who we'll see run in the spring election. Have a look.
Tyler, the budget is coming out next Tuesday, and the government is already dropping a few hints about what's going to be in there. One item that's already been released is a historic $2 billion for primary health care.
Yeah, that's a big chunk of change, which I think probably suggests this is going to be a bit of a big spending budget, which would not be atypical in an election year either. So yeah, $2 billion in primary healthcare, and I believe $234 million specifically for sort of frontline primary healthcare, finding new doctors, things of that nature. I don't think it's a surprise that this would be one of the budget details that's come out this early. This is an issue that is always polled very, very high for Albertans, and especially because the United Conservatives need to sort of broaden their appeal beyond their base, beyond their supporters. They do need to be talking about some of these sort of bread and butter issues that animate sort of a broad cross section of Albertans. And obviously in the post-pandemic time, wait times are way up, surgeries are still being delayed, all that stuff. Healthcare is very, very front of mind for adults, and I think especially those Albertans who have children. So no real surprises there, I don't think.
We recently heard the verdict of Justice Paul Rouleau's report saying the federal government had every right to invoke the Emergencies Act during the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa last winter. Now, Justice Rouleau also made mention of the Coutts border blockade.
He did. So the Coutts border blockade, I'm sure everyone in Lethbridge remembers that a little more clearly perhaps than those of us in Edmonton. I think it was 17 days long, and there's a handful of people facing rather serious sort of weapons charges in relation to that protest. And so Justice Rouleau looked at Coutts as an example of why things had sort of spiraled out of control, beyond the local policing problems and local intelligence problems in Ontario and in Ottawa specifically. He said, look, this was a genuine crisis. You had some sort of extremist cells in Coutts. You had this lengthy blockade of a major economic corridor. And this was the sort of thing that really could have informed the federal government's decision making on invoking the Emergencies Act. So Alberta did get a little shout out, makes it sound a bit fun, which is not necessarily what Justice Rouleau was going for, but Alberta did get a bit of attention in that report. And I should also mention that Tyler Shandro, the Justice Minister, did come out and say, look, Paul Rouleau's report does not change the government's view on it. They still think it was unnecessary, and they're going to continue to support the lawsuits that are in court over the use of the Emergencies Act.
We're getting closer and closer to the provincial election, which is coming up on May the 29th. While we hear a lot about both the UCP and the NDP, there doesn't appear to be a lot going on with the other parties, including the Alberta Party and the Liberal Party. Tyler, like the United States, it appears like Alberta has become a two-party system here.
Yeah, I feel like that's a question that political scientists are maybe watching and scratching their heads because, of course, in the last election, the Alberta Party had some presence, so did the Alberta Liberal Party. And, both those parties had seats, I think, not all that long ago. So it's sort of an interesting situation because both parties do have leaders at the moment. The Alberta Party in particular has a couple candidates here and there. But we're really not hearing very much from them. And a little bit hard to say why. I mean, they're obviously small shops and it's hard to get media attention and those sorts of things. But it is interesting to see that when Stephen Mandel was the leader of the Liberal or Alberta Party, gosh, it's so confusing that they both have basically the same name. The Alberta Party, he managed to make it into news stories, much like Elizabeth May did as the Green Party of Canada leader. And we just don't hear very much from them. So maybe that'll change in the weeks or months ahead. But it is just notable that there are these two other parties, but they're, pretty quiet. Maybe they're hibernating in this cold snap.
Trade Minister Rajan Sani has announced that she's not seeking re-election this spring. As we get closer to the election, do you think maybe we'll hear from more MLAs from both the UCP and NDP who may step down?
There hasn't been much of it, has there? Leela here back in October, I guess it was, also said that she would not be running for the UCP, although I'm actually blanking now on whether or not she said she might run as an independent. And I think Drew Barnes said he was going to run as an independent again as well, and is not, seeking to get back into the UCP. So you do have to wonder if some of the folks who ran against Danielle Smith for the leadership might not want to run this time around.
A year ago, the Freedom Rally had wrapped up in Ottawa. One of the groups that started during that time was Police on Guard for Thee. After the break, we hear from Clay Farnsworth, who shares with us why POG exists and what it hopes to accomplish for Canadians. Keep it right here.